2027 opens not with gunfire, but with silence, the kind that follows exhaustion. Across the Sahel, roads shimmer under 40-degree heat. A convoy of faded green trucks moves slowly through the dust, each one painted with the same words. No tanks. No loans. Only food and freedom. Inside the first truck, sacks of millet replace ammunition crates. The men at the wheel are not soldiers. They are farmers, engineers, and teachers. Their mission is simple: to feed a nation that the world tried to starve. For nearly 3 years, sanctions had cut the arteries of West Africa's economy. Bank transfers froze midstream, imports halted at ports, and aid contracts dissolved overnight. Western headlines predicted collapse. Yet in Ouagadougou, something else began. President Ibrahim Traoré gathered his ministers and said quietly, "If they close the gates, we will plant the road itself." That sentence became doctrine. By mid-2027, it had become a $3 billion enterprise, the Sahel Food Corridor. The idea was radical because it was human. Instead of fighting for loans, the alliance of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger chose to trade grain for grain, region for region. Solar pumps replaced foreign fertilizer shipments. Local barter networks replaced dollar transactions. When one Western diplomat sneered, "You can't run an economy on millet," a farmer in Doré replied, "Watch us." By the end of spring, the first convoy left Ouagadougou heading north. Satellite images later showed the entire route dotted with green specks, irrigation lights powered by sun and stubbornness. Western analysts dismissed it as symbolic, but markets noticed. Food prices in Bamako and Niamey dropped for the first time since 2022. Something impossible was happening. An economy growing under blockade. This was not defiance for its own sake. It was a declaration that dignity could be grown like a crop. When a reporter asked Traoré whether he feared further punishment, he answered, "You can sanction our banks, but not our hunger to live." If this story of resilience matters to you, stay with me. Because what happened next forced even the architects of those sanctions to ask a painful question. How do you punish people who refuse to starve? The birth of the Sahel Food Corridor did not begin in Parliament or at the United Nations. It began in the back rooms of provincial cooperatives, in mud-walled offices where engineers and farmers shared one broken laptop and a single working satellite modem. What they built together was nothing less than an alternative economy. By late 2026, sanctions had already paralyzed international trade across the AES bloc. Fertilizer imports fell 80%. Foreign insurers withdrew, and even humanitarian shipments slowed to a trickle. Traoré's cabinet responded with what one Western analyst called an impossible blueprint: convert $3 billion of previously frozen aid obligations into a self-funded food corridor stretching from southern Burkina Faso to northern Niger, with Mali as the central bridge. It would link 2,400 miles of farmland, irrigation networks, and solar-powered storage hubs under one regional authority, completely outside Western banking systems. Each node in this corridor served a specific function. In Bobo Dioulasso, engineers retrofitted abandoned cotton warehouses into seed banks. In Gao, a network of youth collectives installed modular solar pumps, replacing the diesel systems that had once relied on French imports. In Niamey, a cooperative of women traders created the first grain-backed digital token, its value tied to 10 kilograms of millet rather than the US dollar. Every transaction, every shipment, every kilogram was recorded on a closed blockchain ledger hosted across multiple AES ministries. There was no SWIFT code to freeze, no IMF condition to violate, and no Western intermediary to cut the signal. Western intelligence called it gray trade. In reality, it was survival engineered with discipline. Each truck moving along the corridor carried two things: food and data. When it reached a border, local guards scanned the QR code to register its passage and update supply levels. That data was shared instantly with 3 control centers: Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. By synchronizing delivery routes with rainfall forecasts, the corridor reduced spoilage by 60%. Within months, internal reports confirmed that regional food reserves had grown by 35%, despite ongoing sanctions. At first, the West dismissed these numbers as propaganda. But satellite imagery told a different story. Fields once brown with drought now glowed faintly green under solar irrigation. By mid-2027, Burkina Faso's domestic grain output had risen by 18%, Mali's by 22%, and Niger's by nearly 30%. For the first time in a decade, these nations exported surplus grain to each other. A farmer named Adama Diallo became the face of this transformation. Once dependent on aid from the World Food Program, he now led a cooperative of 200 families cultivating sorghum on reclaimed land outside Dori. When foreign reporters visited, he greeted them with quiet irony. "Last year they sent us boxes of biscuits. This year we send them invoices." His comment went viral across African social media under the hashtag Sahel feeds itself. The scale of the operation soon attracted global attention. Russia offered fertilizer at discounted rates, paid in livestock rather than dollars. Algeria opened its border for corridor transit, reducing costs by 40%. Egypt joined as an observer, intrigued by the barter system's stability amid volatile oil markets. Inside the West, think tanks scrambled to assess what they called a sanctions escape corridor. The Center for Strategic Economics in Washington published a confidential memo warning that the Sahel Alliance has effectively developed a sanctions-proof logistics model, one replicable across the global South. Traoré did not boast. In a rare television appearance, he spoke plainly. "This corridor is not defiance, it is medicine. We were sick of waiting for permission to eat." His words resonated far beyond Africa's borders. In Latin America, small nations studying similar systems requested consultations. Even the IMF, in an unusual tone, noted that community barter mechanisms have mitigated humanitarian risk. Yet behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Western ports began blocking Sahel cargoes under compliance review. Aid agencies faced new restrictions if they cooperated with corridor logistics. But the system had already become too decentralized to stop. For every checkpoint that closed, another 3 opened inland. By August 2027, the Sahel Food Corridor moved nearly 6 million tons of grain, more than the total aid delivered to the region in the previous year. The numbers were undeniable. The sanctions had failed to starve a people who had learned to trade in trust instead of currency. Reflective bridge. And as one U.S. diplomat quietly admitted off record, "We sanctioned their money, but not their imagination." By September 2027, the West finally noticed that its most powerful weapon, economic isolation, was no longer working. What began as a quiet local experiment had turned into a geopolitical shock. The European Commission's confidential briefing, leaked by Le Monde, read, "AES food autonomy threatens to neutralize the sanctions mechanism within the next quarter." The numbers were alarming. Imports from Europe to the Sahel bloc had dropped by 45%, while internal trade within the AES corridor rose by 71%. The report warned, if this trend continues, Europe may lose its last remaining leverage in the region. The political temperature rose overnight. In Brussels, some officials demanded stricter trade surveillance. In Paris, farm unions marched, claiming cheap Sahel grain was entering North African ports and undercutting European prices. The irony was brutal. African food grown under sanctions was now cheaper and cleaner than European subsidized crops. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, the mood was electric. Crowds filled Revolution Square holding stalks of millet like flags. That morning, President Ibrahim Traoré addressed the nation. His speech was short, almost quiet, yet it carried the weight of generations. "They thought hunger would teach us obedience, but hunger taught us cooperation." He paused. No tanks, no loans, only food and freedom. The crowd repeated the words like a prayer. For many Burkinabe, it was the first time in living memory that independence felt tangible. not as a slogan, but as bread on the table. Internationally, the reaction split along moral lines. The U.S. State Department described the corridor as a concerning parallel economy that undermines transparency. But humanitarian agencies saw it differently. The World Food Programme's regional office noted that famine alerts in the Sahel had dropped by nearly 40% since the corridor began. A British aid worker in Gao told reporters, "If this is defiance, then I wish more nations would defy hunger this way." Western media struggled to frame the narrative. Some called it a shadow network, others a black market miracle. Yet public opinion in Europe began to shift. As photos of Sahel farmers harvesting under solar-powered lights spread online, ordinary citizens asked why sanctions were blocking food rather than weapons. Hashtags like #FeedDon'tFreeze and #EndEconomicWar trended briefly in France and Italy. Inside Washington, the debate grew tense. The National Security Council convened a closed session to discuss whether new, secondary sanctions should target the corridor's logistics firms, but advisors warned that such action could backfire. One senior analyst admitted, "If we punish food routes, we become the villain of our own story." The proposal quietly died. In contrast, the African Union moved fast. Within 72 hours of Traoré's speech, 6 additional West African nations requested observer status in the Corridor Initiative, including Ghana and Senegal, countries traditionally aligned with Western donors. The symbolism was undeniable. Power was shifting southward, and the moral compass of global trade was tilting with it. The climax came at the AU Economic Summit in Addis Ababa. For the first time, African leaders debated not loans, but logistics. The Sahel Corridor appeared on the main agenda as model of sanction resilience. When Traoré took the podium, delegates expected defiance. Instead, they heard restraint. "This is not rebellion," he said. "It is recovery. The world calls us poor because we trade what they cannot measure: trust." The hall erupted in applause that lasted nearly 2 minutes. The Ugandan representative later said, "That speech was the moment Africa stopped asking permission to survive." Back in the West, financial analysts issued quiet warnings. African grain futures were stabilizing faster than global markets expected. The London Financial Times wrote, "Burkina Faso's food corridor represents a new kind of economic insurgency, one fought not with tariffs, but with self-sufficiency." Even critics had to acknowledge what had happened. The sanctions intended to choke supply had instead fertilized unity. The "forbidden corridor," as the IMF once labeled it, became the lifeline of the continent. And in that transformation lay a deeper truth. Punishment loses power when people learn to feed themselves. If this moment inspired you, mark your city below. The world once thought the Sahel would collapse. But what if this is where Africa begins to rise? The success of the Sahel Food Corridor was not measured in GDP charts or foreign praise. It was measured in the sound of full markets. In towns like Kaya, Mopti, and Tillaberi, the silence of waiting lines disappeared. For the first time since the sanctions began, market stalls overflowed with local grain. Women who once queued for imported rice now sold their own harvests under banners reading, "Made by our hands." Prices stabilized, and so did tempers. What began as a survival mechanism had evolved into a new kind of social contract. Production for dignity, not debt. Inside Burkina Faso, the political landscape shifted overnight. Traoré's approval rating soared past 80%, but he used the moment not to consolidate power, rather to decentralize it. The government launched People's Cooperatives of Sovereignty, giving every province partial ownership of the food storage hubs and trading depots. The message was clear: this victory belongs to you. Each cooperative elected local councils to manage storage quotas, transport schedules, and trade credits. Bureaucrats lost control to farmers, and few complained. "They are more efficient than we ever were," admitted a transport official in Ouagadougou. In classrooms once powered by foreign NGOs, students now studied from textbooks labeled Economics of Self-Reliance. Teachers explained how the corridor worked as a civic lesson, how a sack of millet could replace a Western bond as the foundation of trust. One 16-year-old girl told a local reporter, "We used to write essays about aid. Now we write plans for irrigation." The ripple effects reached beyond economics. Rural exodus slowed dramatically. Young men who once left for Libya or Europe returned to work in food transport cooperatives. The Ministry of Interior reported a 28% drop in illegal border crossings in just 8 months. The reason was simple. There was finally something worth staying for. Yet success brought new challenges. As the corridor's revenues grew, so did the temptation of corruption. Traoré's administration responded swiftly, introducing a grain audit system where every ton was logged publicly through the national blockchain. "Transparency," he declared, "is the only fertilizer that keeps a revolution alive." International observers took note. A team from the African Development Bank called the Sahel model a precedent for sovereign food financing. Even skeptical economists admitted the social impact was undeniable. Rural employment up 40%, child malnutrition down 35%, and school attendance at record highs. Still, the West's discomfort persisted. Editorials in European newspapers warned of authoritarian efficiency, arguing that too much state coordination could mask political control. But within the Sahel, people viewed it differently. In interviews, citizens described the system not as control, but as protection. "They used to manage us," said a farmer near Tenkodogo. "Now we manage ourselves." The corridor also reshaped religion and community life. Mosques and churches became distribution centers during harvest season. Faith leaders preached unity through work, declaring food a sacred right. "He who feeds his brother defies no one," said an imam in Niamey, paraphrasing Traoré's message. The line spread like a proverb across social media. And yet, beneath the optimism, uncertainty lingered. Would the system survive another wave of sanctions? Could it withstand internal sabotage or pressure from elites who had lost their privileges? Late-night radio hosts debated these questions openly. One veteran caller summed it up best. "They punished our leaders before. Now they must punish an entire people, and that will not be so easy." As the rainy season approached, grain convoys continued rolling north, headlights cutting through the dark like symbols of defiance. Villages along the route began to treat the passing trucks as a kind of national parade, children waving flags, elders blessing drivers with water. Every delivery became a ritual of continuity. In those moments, the Sahel's new identity took form. Not the land of hunger, but the land that outlasted control. Emotional bridge question to next section. But outside the Sahel, in Washington and Brussels, a new question was forming. How should the world deal with a region that no longer fears punishment? When the Sahel Food Corridor appeared on Washington's morning briefings, it wasn't labeled as an agricultural story. It was flagged under national security. Analysts at the Pentagon called it a soft power inversion. For decades, food aid had been America's most persuasive diplomatic tool in Africa. Now, the nations once dependent on those shipments had built a system immune to leverage. The State Department issued a cautious statement. "We recognize the importance of regional resilience and remain committed to humanitarian principles." Between the lines, it was an admission that sanctions had hit their ceiling. In private, U.S. envoys requested informal consultations with the AES bloc through the African Union. The same governments once blacklisted for non-compliance were now being studied for their innovation. European reactions were more fractured. In Paris, opposition lawmakers accused the government of sanction fatigue, asking why France continued to punish nations that no longer noticed. In Berlin, policymakers quietly urged re-engagement through green energy partnerships, fearing that Russia and China were gaining footholds through the corridor's logistics. Beijing, for its part, watched closely. Chinese analysts described the corridor as proof of a multipolar supply chain. They noted that Africa had achieved something even China once struggled with: strategic autonomy without military confrontation. Russia, too, joined the applause, offering fertilizer and wheat exchanges to expand the network northward. But the real surprise came from the humanitarian community. The United Nations Food Council, once pressured to isolate the Sahel, reversed course. Its 2027 report stated plainly, "Local food sovereignty has proven more stable under sanctions than international aid under compliance." It was the first time in history that an official UN document validated a sanctioned nation's internal policy as a model. Media coverage in the US began to shift. Major networks ran human interest stories showing African farmers reclaiming arid land. Commentators asked uncomfortable questions. If hunger no longer guarantees influence, what does? The answer was emerging on every screen: self-reliance. At the policy level, Washington began exploring what it called constructive disengagement. Sanctions remained on paper but softened in practice. American grain firms sought indirect contracts through African subsidiaries. Quiet diplomacy replaced moral outrage. Behind the geopolitical maneuvering, one truth became clear. The world had just watched an empire of dependency crack. The Sahel had rewritten the map not with borders but with balance. And as the cameras turned away, one question lingered in every Western capital. What happens when control fails and cooperation takes its place? By the end of 2027, the $3 billion Sahel Food Corridor had done something no summit or sanction ever could. It made hunger political and dignity practical. From Ouagadougou to Niamey, the word corridor no longer meant a strip of road. It meant a path between dependence and destiny. The experiment born from punishment had become a philosophy. When food moves freely, people do too. Ibrahim Traoré's final address that December was simple but unforgettable. Standing before rows of farmers, he said, "They asked us how long we could survive. We will answer by how long we can share." His words carried across radios, markets, and classrooms. In that sentence lay the essence of the Sahel's defiance, not rage but endurance. For the West, this was a moral turning point. Sanctions had aimed to discipline governments, but they had instead educated citizens. Across the Sahel, people discovered that sovereignty was not a speech at the United Nations. It was a field that feeds its own children. The West had underestimated what hunger can teach. When people have nothing left to lose, they find what cannot be taken. And so the story closed where it began, in silence. The same trucks that once rolled through dust kept rolling, engines humming through twilight. No parades, no headlines, just the rhythm of independence measured in kilometers of road and tons of grain. The world had learned that control fades, but cooperation endures. If you're watching this from far away, ask yourself, when aid becomes obedience, is self-reliance still rebellion, or simply the beginning of respect? If this story of the Sahel touched you, write your city below. If you believe freedom begins with a meal, press like and share this message. And if you still believe that dignity is worth more than approval, stay with us, because this is not the end. It's the map of a world being rewritten by ordinary hands. This video is a narrative commentary based on public sources and geopolitical analysis. It represents an interpretive exploration under Fair Use 2025 and does not claim legal or diplomatic authority.